going to have an easier agenda. We're not going to try and pack everything that we want to do in 90 minutes, but so far we haven't succeeded. So, but welcome everyone. This is our third call in the Adapting CLD Processes to COVID-19 series. And I request everyone to be on mute, please.
Okay.
And now, Gunjan, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Perfect, thank you. So because of the number of people that we normally have on these calls, we are not able to do introductions the way we like to do. So we're going to request everybody, if you can put in your name and where you are from, your organization into the chat box, that's going to be wonderful. I already see Samuel's done that, so thank you. That's a way for getting to know each other. And especially if you're not on the MCLD mailing list, then the only way we can get minutes to you or any of the materials that we share in today's call across to you is if you put your email ID in that chat box for us to share. So like I said, this is the third call in our series that we've been doing. We've had excellent participation in the first two calls. We are hoping to see similar numbers in this call, but we started a little late, so we let people come in. Nelly and I are going to be facilitating today's call. We have a few ground rules which kind of have been the same throughout our calls. A, please be on mute unless you are speaking. Otherwise, there's a lot of background noise. B, there is a raised hands button in Zoom. So raise your hand if you would like to speak, or put in a message in the chat box. John is going to be monitoring the chat box for us. He will make sure that anybody who wants to speak or any opinion which is expressed out there is shared with the group. But just for the, for convenience, please do put in whatever you want to say in the chat box, because we do want to hear from you. And in the past, we've seen that these chat boxes are really rich sources of ideas, conversations, and interactions. So I'm going to move straight to the structure of today's meeting. Nelly, can we go to the next screen? Thank you. So we are going to start with a quick recap of what happened in our last meeting, but then we're very quickly going to move on to a little bit of discussion around adaptations for building long-term resilience. This is something, as those of you who were on the last call would remember, this is a discussion that we started there, and there was a reflections paper that was circulated again on this. Next, and this is the exciting and the new thing that we're going to be doing in today's meeting, is we're going to do a scenario planning workshop and exercise. We'll tell you more about it when we get to that segment. We will go into breakout groups where we will be doing scenario planning. Then we reconvene, the breakout groups share what they have discussed. And finally, we are going to actually, after a brief discussion, look at the working group and what it's shaping out to be. So in the last two calls, we've heard from multiple people about the need for a working group. So we've listened to you. We have asked you for ideas on what the group could do, and we'll get to that. And finally, we'll close with our next steps. So welcome everyone again, and Nelly, over to you.
Thanks, Gunjan, and thanks everyone for joining for the third call. We're, I think, all really amazed that there has been so much participation and interest, and that this has gone as far as it has, and we hope it keeps going. So very quickly, I'm just going to recap from the last meeting that was held on May 20th. It was our second global call. And there we focused on thinking about the next 6 to 10 weeks, as well as the longer term. In May, and even more so now, countries were at different stages of the virus in terms of restrictions and need and contagion. So that call focused first on trying to think through, as I said, the next 6 to 10 weeks, what that would look like, what opportunities would be coming as restrictions might ease, what the challenges would be, what would be possible for the first time after a long time of being shut down, and how we could prepare for that. But then also thinking about how that moves into the longer term and how we can strengthen our programming to help communities be better prepared and better able to respond to crises moving forward. So we had a couple of polls, we had breakout groups, again, discussing across the 4 barriers that we identified in the first call. So limited access, inability to convene, disruptions to procurement and service delivery, and people's shifting priorities and time availability, as well as whole group discussions. 2 of the themes that we highlighted and we'll return to today are how we can better integrate crisis preparation into our regular programming, and also what roles and functions can be owned even more by actual community members rather than by staff or by volunteers from outside of the community. So very quickly, a couple of key takeaways that came from that call, and the summary of this call is also up on the website for everyone to look at any time. But thinking about the shorter term, people talked about how, again, there's different activities that are possible in different places. In some places, they're easing restrictions and you can actually have community meetings, but in other places, the focus was still very much on raising awareness that the virus was real and was a threat, and on making masks and soap and things like that. For both the short and the longer term, we heard from a number of people about the importance of communication and coordination at different levels, so with communities, but also with governments and networks of funders, civil society, including how important it is to hold leaders accountable for where resources and funds are going at this time. And of course, noting the challenges that come with communication, particularly to rural areas around bandwidth and who has access to cell phones. We also highlighted that it's the community leaders and the community representatives and members that know what the need is and what the possibilities are most directly and the best, and that our role is always to catalyze communities making their own decisions and own change and taking action. And thinking about the long term, looking at what we might need to reprioritize in terms of the activities we focus on. So there's the secondary effects of the virus, including child marriage or more violence against women and children, support to livelihood regeneration and business sectors to readjust, because poverty will be going up and the way people do business will be different. And also how in the future to have that kind of trusted, accurate information in place faster. And another point that was brought up was, how communities can be more self-sustaining in terms of sort of garden kitchens or having savings, different things like that that we might need to or might be able to consider in the future, and would make our programming stronger and our communities better able to, or more resilient to crises in the future. So that was a very quick summary of that call. I'm sure I left out important things. The chat box is there for everyone to bring up more ideas that might be critical, but we wanted to just move right away into some of the discussion. So we would like to hear, let me move the slide, there we go, from all of you guys about how your organizations have been thinking about this sort of longer term planning and being prepared for the longer term challenges of COVID-19, but also other kinds of crises. What are some of the ideas that you're thinking about, and how does that fit with the work and approaches that you have? So I'm going to invite Pascal, who's the coordinator for the West Africa chapter of the movement, to speak. And while he does, everyone please write in your own responses into the chat box. And as Gunjan mentioned, John will make sure that we see those, and hopefully we'll have time to hear from someone else as well. Pascal, are you there?
Yeah, yes, I'm there. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Pascal. I'm based in Cotonou. I'm the regional director for the Hunger Project West Africa, and I'm coordinating and facilitating the movement for community-led development in West Africa region. From the, let's say, from the last calls, I will mention 2 takes away. The first one is solidarity in physical distancing, not social distancing. And this sounds very much and much with the principle of the MCLD, because MCLD is about interconnectedness, It is about partnership. It is about supporting each other, and no place for social distancing. Very important. And we have recently mentioned this in how we frame COVID response message to communities, particularly in one communities when 2 CLD members in Benin has organized an awareness session to communities. The second is related to how the pandemic of COVID-19 relate to other issues, key issues of development, poverty, climate change, water, and so on. This question confirms again the need for a holistic approach and the need for transformative change to build the resilience for communities, which is prerequisite for sustainable development. This aspect also has been mentioned in the same communities where 2 civil society members of our chapter has organized the awareness session that I mentioned earlier. And the third, in the line with the holistic aspect, we decided within our chapter to talk about first, the guideline provided by the government, but we need to add other aspects to make sure that COVID-19 is not only a pandemic issue of health. And we have mentioned there, first, the COVID-19 is real, and second, adequate nutrition, focusing on local vegetable that could really grow very fast. We mentioned moringa and other. And the last point I will mention is how does the COVID-19 affect our work on the ground? Yes, we talked about this earlier, not today, but in a previous call, that as we are organized as Hunger Project, we have animators on the ground. We make sure that we fully respect the guidelines provided by the government, physical distancing, the wear of mask, and they continue doing the work on the ground. So on the ground, we could say the COVID-19 doesn't really affect our work, but what is new is we need to make sure that our communities fully respect the guidelines provided by the government. Thank you. That's I got to be fair.
Thank you, Pascal. And yeah, I think that touches on a number of the points that started to come up last time. So it's interesting and also really motivating, I think, to see how organizations are actually applying these ideas and thinking about the livelihood side, the nutritional resiliency side. So, John, there might be any comments? We have just a minute because then we have to transition over to
So Guillermo Sardi reports in his organization, we've invested in masks, soap, water tanks, and antibacterial gels to help community kitchens comply with necessary prevention measures. We have already covered Caracas, the capital, and the nearby cities. We hope to, by the end of the month, cover 214 community kitchens nationwide.
Wow. All right, thank you. Well, there'll be a lot of opportunity to keep thinking about these adaptations, both in the sort of immediate for COVID-19, but also the longer term, what's going to strengthen the programming in our next activity, which Gunjan will talk about. As you know, we don't know what the future will look like, but there's a number of versions that we can sort of start to imagine and prepare for. So with that, Gunjan, I think I will hand over to you to do the tough work of explaining this complicated exercise to all of us.
So what we're going to do over the next 60 to 70 minutes is a process known as scenario planning. And at the beginning, I think what we do want to say is that we are all in this learning together. learning with each other and from each other. So neither Nelly nor I are experts in scenario planning, but we do hope that what we've seen from the previous meetings is how much we learn when we try and do these things together. So it's in that spirit that we are launching this. Many of you may be familiar with the term scenario planning. It's something which is normally undertaken by organizations when they look at long-term strategy planning. So it normally is done with a wide time horizon of 5, 10, 15 years, just because of the difficulty in predicting future events over that time horizon. But we do know that right now we are in such uncertain times that we can't even predict events for the next 3 or 6 months. And so that's why an exercise in scenario planning may be helpful for us. So what is scenario planning, and what is the purpose of doing this exercise here with everybody? So scenario planning is really an approach which says that organizations are much better at, preparing themselves for the potential effects of potential future events than they are actually at, predicting these future events. So in other words, a year ago, perhaps none of us would have predicted, for all the strategic planning and other exercises that we had done, that this is a situation that we would have found ourselves in. However, as people told us in the first 2 calls, we have seen the effects of, effects which are similar to what we are seeing now as a result of other crises that we have experienced in the past, be it Ebola, be it tsunami, be it humanitarian conflicts and other situations. So the effects remain the same or are very similar across multiple crises, despite the fact that we can't predict the crisis. Can we prepare for these effects? And that's kind of been what we've been trying to also do in our last few calls. So we thought that this exercise could be a way of structuring a lot of the rich ideas that came out of these 2 previous calls. But more importantly, I think the purpose of this exercise is really that over the last month and a half, in individual sessions with many of you, as well as in small group sessions, we asked you, why do you want these meetings to continue? What do you gain from these meetings? And what we heard was that these meetings often leave you with a kernel of a new idea, or they leave you with a thought, or shift your thinking in a way that you're able to go back to your organizations, to your colleagues and community leaders. And we heard from partners on the ground on how they've actually done this in their communities and within their organizations, wherein they take certain things that come out in these meetings and discuss them, and these lead them in different directions. So really, that shifting of, that working together and collaborative strategizing, where we shift our own thinking, but also shift each other's thinking. And that's really the purpose of today's exercise. We also hope that many people had asked for tools and processes that they can adapt and use in their organizations. So we hope that if this is something that you find useful, you will be able to take this back and do this with your own teams. And this is the reason why, in preparation for today's session, we shared with you a video and a reading. The reading that we shared is really the basis on which we have designed today's session. So if you do decide to do this with your organizations, that is available, as well as a series of materials that we would be happy to share on this. So what does we do, and what is it that we are hoping to do today in the next 30 minutes in our breakout groups, right? We began by creating 4 scenarios. So we recognize that there is a huge diversity in the organizations that we represent, we work for, and that are on this call. And we took the experiences of the difficulties that you had experienced over the last 4 months to create 4 programs. These are fictional organizations. None of them exist, but they are modeled very closely on the work of what we've heard from our partners in these calls. So the first program is the Bono Youth Collective. This is a small organization headquartered out of Maiduguri in Nigeria, working in a humanitarian situation and providing equitable access to services for internally displaced people. It's a small organization with 10 to 15 people and an annual budget of $40,000 US. Now, this and details about each of these 4 organizations were already sent out last week, both as audio clips as well as write-ups. So you can always refer to them in your own group meetings. They have much more details. The second organization was To Salud en tus manos, it is an organization that works in 3 countries in Latin America. It is headquartered out of Denver, Colorado, has 30 people on its staff, and an annual budget of $1.5 million US dollars. So an organization that focuses on health and gender education and works through schools and also provides midday meals. Our third organization is the TLC, or the Listening Collaborative, works globally across 15 countries with a budget of $12 million annually, headquartered out of New York, 200 people on staff, and works only in developmental context to address hunger, poverty, and good governance. And our last organization is the ComCan Initiative, or the Community Scan Initiative. Huge global organization, 45 countries, works across a variety of humanitarian and developmental sectors, an annual budget of $400 million, and we're talking of 3,000 people. So these are the 4 organizations that we created, which we kind of hope represent, to some extent, the work that you do. Now, the first step for us was to look at what are the guidelines. Typically, scenario planning is done, it's an intensive exercise which is done over 2 days, 1 or 2 days, full day workshops. You really immerse yourself in the process. We can't do that in 60 or 90 minutes. And our objective today is not that we are going to come up with solutions to the problems that we will be facing over the next 6-9 months. And that, whatever we try, even if we did a 2-day workshop, we would not come up with the solution that that would work for all of us. Our objective today is to create a way of thinking or share a process that may help us in our own individual work. So with that in mind, scenario planning normally has 4 steps. We've done some of this work for you for the breakout groups, and the rest is what you will be doing in the breakout groups today. So what have we done? We've identified the guiding principles for our organizations, and you will see it in the write-ups because that's the starting point. The next important thing to do is really to identify what are the key drivers in programming, operations, and funding across these organizations. And later, after the session is over, we will share with you all the homework we did to arrive at these key drivers. So you'll be able to, again, see and use it if you want to do a similar process. But essentially, for each of the drivers, for each of the organizations, we looked at what is the importance of that driver for the organization and what is the risk. And we selected the top 4 or 5 which had high importance and high risk, just because we wanted to make this a very manageable exercise and because clarity is more important than complexity in scenario planning. So we have the drivers. You will see that in the sheets that you receive for your breakout groups, you will see the drivers that have been identified for your group in the column on the left-hand side, which says key drivers at risk. The next thing that we did was to identify the external factors that are likely to influence the course of events over the next few months. So Nelly, if you go back to the previous slide, please. Yes, so this is common across all the groups. You would have all received this in the documents that were sent out earlier. So we identified 4 factors that we see playing a key role over the next few months in terms of what our best, medium, and worst case scenarios would be, the pace of economic recovery, whether physical distancing or lockdown measures come into play, whether government, public infrastructure and services will be running or not, and finally, the level of public anxiety that comes both from the way things are moving, government response, and other activities. So we looked at them to create what would happen in each of these cases in a best, medium, and worst case scenario. So for instance, if it's a best case scenario, New Zealand, where it stands today, right? There is no lockdown. Everything is back to normal because they don't have any more cases of COVID-19 happening. There is a lot of confidence in the people on what the government is doing and the government response. That's best case. Or we know of worst case scenarios where we are anticipating prolonged recession, where there's so much of mistrust. There is fear of lockdown happening again because cases are rising very rapidly, right? So that's the work that we have done. Now, what is it that you're going to be doing today in the breakout groups? Nelly, sorry, can we go back to that, the next slide? So you're going to now see that for the key drivers that have been identified for your group, what would happen in the best, medium, and worst case scenario. So for instance, if convening is a key part of the work that you do, what happens in the best case scenario? But what happens in the worst case scenario if there is a lockdown, right? If people are so afraid to convene and to meet each other, what's going to happen in that scenario? So you're going to do that in your small groups with each of the drivers. Once we have done that, once we know what the effects will be, we move on to, okay, what will be our action items? So that's when we start talking of solutions in scenario planning. And typically, again, it's a very extensive, complicated exercise where we talk of, okay, what are the things that could work across all three cases, right? What are things that you can do very quickly and that you can reverse if needed? So what are the fast and flexible solutions? Or what are the long, permanent, but harder solutions that you can't reverse? You know, for instance, a change in your programming, a change in the strategic direction of your organization overall. You know, supposing you decide that maybe convening is not the way to go for us, right? Hard decisions, permanent decisions, long-term impacts. But for this exercise, again, because of the limited time, we don't need to go into that. We just start thinking of solutions. And again, I want to stress that what we are expecting for people to bring back is not solutions, perfect solutions. We are hoping that there is enough interaction for you to begin thinking of solutions for your own drivers within your communities and organizations.
What we're going to do now, I hope that you all had a chance to get started. As Gunjan said, as always, there was much more to talk about than there was time to get to it all. But we will hear now, just for 2 minutes from each group, if that's okay. We'll start actually with the group that I was in, which was Program A, called Borno Youth Collective. Gunjan explained it as we were moving into the activity, but it's based in, this imaginary organization is based in Maiduguri, works in northern Nigeria with internally displaced people. It's a small organization, and we train youth to provide education on rights and advocacy and equitable service delivery. And then the organization itself also provides some essential services in this humanitarian setting. So in our group, it was Daisy who was going to speak. Are you on, Daisy?
Yes, I'm on.
Nelly,
Hello,
would you be
everybody,
sharing
once
your
again.
screen?
Sorry?
Sharing the spreadsheet, or do you want me to?
Oh, if you don't mind, actually, that would be great.
Okay.
Sorry, Daisy.
Go ahead.
I'll stop share. Go ahead, Daisy. Are you still there, Daisy? Did we lose you?
Okay,
Daisy?
hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, so yes, so for our small organization, what we looked at as the best case scenario was for communities to be able to convene. In the best case scenario, communities would still be convening, the structures would be in place and able to support the communities. There would be easier communication, and maybe also some committees, some form of structures working. And there would be, like, if it was the case of education, large groups of students would be able to also meet and have some level of education. And we also saw that at least it would be possible to organize the neighbors to help each other, either in terms of food or in terms of other support, in terms of communication. And they would also be knowing who needs help and how they can take it. For the medium case scenario, we also see that there would be, maybe for education, school centers would be open for only a few number of people and for a few hours. And they would also be looking at the strengthening, starting to think ahead in terms of either the long-term looking at how we can maybe strengthen their livelihood, strengthening communication, especially on the rights, since we are working in a community that deals with the rights, and also strengthening communication. It wouldn't be easy. They don't have enough communication. Maybe there are not many ways of how we can get it there. But there would also be still some collective action, but limited and regulated in terms of social distancing, in terms of number of participants, and also the approaches which can be used. So there's some flexibility, but there's no total flexibility on what can be done and where. And then for the worst case scenario, we see that it is in a deplorable state. It's very hard to reach. Most of the communities would have to be reached either by the state or by the civil society organizations. And they would have to be relying on the government support because convening service delivery would be sort of near impossible. And also they would, I think it was emphasized that the community would need a lot of effort, a lot of support, and reaching out to this community. And there was also a feeling that the distribution channels wouldn't be very easy because of the existing situation. I think that's what we could pick where when the time got us, or what I could put. But members from my group can add on.
I think you captured it really well, Daisy. And yes, from our group, but also from all the groups, if there's anything that you want to raise that you talked about, but also things that you might not have had time to talk about in the breakout session, just write it in the chat box. So next we'll hear from group program B, which is a fake program called Tu Salud en Tus Manos, which works on health and gender education in El Salvador, Honduras, and Ecuador. And it has about 30 people on its staff with a small headquarters in the US. So whoever is going to present from group two.
Thank you, Nelly. That would be me on behalf of the team that I worked with. I believe our screen is shared. Our spreadsheet is shared, right, Nelly?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I believe so, yep.
Yeah, and so I think we took the same approach as your team, Nelly, in that we wanted to see how the process works out. And so we didn't look at all the scenarios for all of the drivers, but we instead just focused on two and then immediately went into the solutions and the action items associated with that. I want to, since the training volunteer thing, I think there might be similarities with what your team has brought up. I just want to focus on my feedback here on our driving factor as far as funding and grants are concerned. And I think we got some really good feedback and discussions going around that. From a best case scenario, some of our team members said, you end up getting more money and you get some new additional creative sources of funding that you never thought you would get. And then of course your immediate action item associated with that is to continue ramping up your work, get proposals out. And then another good point that was raised is if you have that additional source of funding coming in, ensure that you have the monitoring and evaluation infrastructure in place to fully account for that additional funding that come in so that you don't lose it in a long time because of institutional oversight. So ensure that the responsibility is there. On the medium case scenario, if you get funding, get dropped and you don't have funding, one example that we came across is that funders are getting very more restricted around criteria and they become very specific on what you are allowed to do with their funding. And so a solution associated with that is seeking additional funding that can speak to those criteria that are excluded by particular funders. And working around that in order to still hang on to that funder with the strict criteria, but then seeking alternative ways of making up for that criteria. And then, of course, the worst case scenario is you don't have funding at all and your funding gets restricted severely. And then as an organization, action item is go to the drawing board and see how can you work as bare bone as possible, seeing how you can survive as an organization on a skeleton infrastructure. Another suggestion that came up in the group is that you should seek out within communities more volunteers. Be frank and open to your supporters and illustrate, listen, it's not going well at this point and we need to depend on volunteers to help us through this time. And another, and I want to end off with this interesting point that was also raised as a solution and action item is seeking out the diaspora, the expat communities as an alternative approach for funding and support, especially if they are not involved as funders and donors at the moment. So those were very interesting and engaging discussions that came up in our team, in our group. Thank you, Nelly.
Yeah, that's really great. You guys went quite in depth on that in a short period of time. So thanks for that. The third group we will hear from is called the Listening Collective. It's a fairly large organization, works in 15 countries on issues of hunger, poverty, and good governance, and has a headquarters in the US, but all the country offices are fairly autonomous. So who is going to speak from that group?
I'm speaking from that group. So we kind of went through all of these and had some of the similar outcomes that other teams have had. But basically, best case scenario, we had volunteers that are trained and volunteers and leaders that are trained and prepared, good infrastructure for good and consistent communication, supplies and commodities needed are not experiencing inflated prices, and existing funding is flexible and can be reallocated as needed as different needs arise. And then contracts with obligations are provided some flexibility to be able to kind of focus on what needs are arising. The medium case scenario is volunteers are not present or training needs to be done virtually because there's irregular and inconsistent communication abilities with the field. Supplies and commodities have somewhat inflated prices and there may not be enough funds to reallocate sufficiently, so not being able to address all of the needs that arise. Then having some flexibility with contractual obligations to donors or grantors, but not much. Then worst case scenario is low levels of training, difficult or no communication for sustained periods of time with volunteers and staff, maybe an aggressive resurgence of COVID-19, then with less communication and oversight and not having enough funds, there may be some opportunities for fraud or mismanagement of funding. And then having inflexible contracts with grantors or funders, and maybe even to the point of having to return funds if they're not able to be used exactly as defined. So as you can see in our Google Sheet, we just kind of had one blob of solutions. We didn't really allocate them per scenario, but some of these included having every level prepared within the organization for adequate communication and being very trained in emergency procedures, adopting digital platforms to be able to adapt to communication needs in different scenarios. Then having proactive, deliberate, deeper training of volunteers and staff for greater resilience. So actually a lot of our solution discussion revolved around adding that sustainable element, that resiliency, kind of decentralizing the dependence of people in the communities on governments or the organization or other outside people, but empowering the communities to utilize and mobilize domestic resources and being able to be equipped with the knowledge and skills to be able to kind of deal with situations as they arise. And then also having advocacy with government for emergency structures, and being able to maybe even at a government level have people trained to respond to more emergency situations. And if I forgot anything that anyone on my team wants to add, please do.
Yes, definitely in the group chat. And there's actually a lot of things coming in the chat box that we are making sure to capture. The final group, Group D, it's the largest organization called ComCam, for 45 countries, works globally, both humanitarian and development settings. Who can I pass it to from that group?
Yeah, sure. Arthur here presenting for Group D. We focused a lot on just some key areas, looking at best case scenario, medium case, and worst case scenario. For CONCAM, convening for community meetings, for generating awareness, and so on, collecting feedback. Best case scenario, we looked at CONCAM is not in the field. We may not know what is happening in the field. When you go back, you need to know first what is happening in the community, the processes that they've gone through, communication, because we also talked about the communities may have felt abandoned if programs had stopped within the communities. And so going back to those communities and looking at ways in which we can re-engage may be a difficult task. Under medium case scenario, CONCAM, again, is not in the field, and we may not know what is happening in the field. And so when we go back, we need to first understand what the communities have gone through. Again, similar to what we had in the best case scenario. In the worst case scenario, we may lose the ability or the interest of the people to convene, especially with the community feeling that they may not have been supported if the operations had moved out of the community. And so we may get a lot of pushback from the communities when re-engaging. A couple of things that we discussed outside of this best, medium, and worst case scenario is that, just for interest, is that there will be need for discussion to re-engage with local governments as well, especially when looking at the pace of economic recovery. There will also be need to look at M&E procedures that will need to take place in terms of gathering data. Again, because we may have pushback from the communities. We discussed that the M&E side may have to be reviewed very, very deeply so that we can understand what impact has happened since operations had stopped. And then going forward, under supplies and procurement, we looked at ways in which if supplies are not there, again, people may feel abandoned. Rapid disruptions, difficult to think around how do we re-engage with the people so that they can believe that COVID is something that we all need to work together to address. If there's anything else that I missed from my team, please feel free to add on. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Arthur, and to your whole team. We're going to move on in just a moment to a quick discussion and a couple of other points before we close. But yes, please keep putting in all of your any comments into the chat box. It's becoming a very interesting discussion there. And I think one thing, we'll come back later to how we can continue to pursue this scenario planning. But I think one thing that's interesting is, some of the key drivers are quite similar across organizations, even though the scale and scope and where they work are different. And I think it'll be interesting to see how we can kind of put it all together into developing a big, best, worst, and medium case set of scenarios. Gunjan, I will share my screen now back to the slides and you can take it from there.
Yeah, and because we are running short on time, I think we did have a discussion session that we wanted to run around some of the key learnings that have emerged from the scenario, the very small slice of scenario planning that we tried to get into But I'm guessing we probably don't have time for that. So we have the questions here. If there's anything that you want to share around those, feel free to put them in the chat box. But in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to very quickly go over what scenario planning looks in its entirety. So what have we done and where do we go from here if we were doing this in our organizations, or if we wanted to go back and do that. So as you may have noticed from, and I know I can say this from Nelly and me, that when we started imagining the, scenario planning exercise on how the drivers are, how we would look at best, medium, and worst case scenario, we did not think of so much of what had happened here, right? So these were all really, there were times where we've exchanged messages saying, oh, this is not how we were thinking of the medium, best, and worst case scenarios, right? Oh, this is a very different understanding of what we had. So I think this has helped us to expand our own understanding, because what was in our group, for instance, what was very clear that we had identified certain drivers, but a lot of our discussion in the ComCan initiative was really around drivers, because some of the drivers that Nelly and I had not included in this were drivers that people felt were extremely important. And so we went on to talk about, things like, do we need to relook at the way we are running our programs? For instance, this COVID disruption and what has happened here in the interim in our in our communities. Does that mean that we can't work the way we were working on our programming going forward, even when things are back to normal, as normal as they can be back to, right? Like, does it mean that we need to re-engage and restart that process with our communities of understanding what do they need from us? Has that changed what they need from us? And do we need to look for new partners or other ways of delivering what they need in the view of what's happened? So the discussion was very different from the discussion we had anticipated, but that's kind of where scenario planning really comes in that you collaboratively try and think and build on things that you would not have thought about. Now, the next step in this exercise would have been that after we had thought through the different things, the different drivers, the different, ways the best, medium, and worst case scenarios would happen, you kind and identify the key ones under each, because you can't address 20 or 30 in each column. That's not feasible. It's not practical. And so again, it's an exercise in building that consensus, in listening to all the voices, but then seeing that how do we collectively make sense of this? It's part of the community processes that we do, but how do we apply this in our own program planning? So the next step would really have been for us to, if we had the time, to look at each of the things that we had identified, and then to narrow in and hone in on those 2 or 3 things of consensus that we could come to. And then solutions, when we get to that, for each of those points, we look at it, as I mentioned earlier, solutions that would work across all the 3 scenarios. Because at least in our group, the discussion was that a lot of the factors we thought would happen across the 3 scenarios. So the effects would also be very similar in a lot of cases across the 3 scenarios. Our responses to those effects may differ, right? So identification of what is common, what is fast and quick, short-term, immediate need, what is it that we do in the long term and requires deeper thinking. And the 4th step of scenario planning, which is very, very organization-centered and very specific really to the work that you would do, is about once you have gone through the process of identifying the risks, once you have identified how the risks may play out in each of these scenarios and the solutions to those risks, what are the triggers that will make you act on those action items? So for instance, if financial viability is one of your drivers, and if one of the action points was that, okay, we would have to stop this particular segment of our programming in the worst case scenario, then at what point, what is that trigger when you will do that, right? At what level do you activate that response? So that's the whole scenario planning exercise. I'm sorry we haven't had time. This is something very rapid. As Nelly said, we will have time going forward if people are really interested in this to explore other aspects of it. But we just wanted to bring this to the table as a tool, a process that may be available for people if they want to do this going forward. And if you have learnings, if you have opinions, we would really love to hear from you on your takeaways, on what you learned and what what more could be done here. But Nelly, I'm going to move this, give this back to you so that you can take us through very quickly the working group, which was created in response to the demands in the last 2 calls.
Great. Do you mind putting up the working group TOR?
Okay, sure.
Gunjan?
I will. Give me a second to just get.
No worries. I will start. We have just a few minutes, and hold on 1 second. Sorry. So one thing that came up in our previous call, we had heard from a number of people that there was a great deal of interest in perhaps pursuing some of the ideas that have started on the calls through a working group. And for those who were on the May call, you'll remember that we did a poll and we discussed this as an option, and about 80% of participants asked that there be at least one working group. So in the meantime, in order to take that forward just a little bit, Gunjan and I have met with a number of members from the movement across different regions to start to brainstorm what this might look like. So Gunjan has just put up a draft terms of reference. It's a skeleton. After this meeting, we are going to make this public and share it with all of you so that you can provide comments into it and feedback and just take more time to look at it. But quickly, and as always, if you have comments or questions, just put them in the chat box and we'll make sure that they get saved and absorbed. So you'll see here, a lot of things are left empty for the working group itself to figure out, but at the top, it's looking at the rationale for having this, which would be to bring CLD organizations and movement members together to share experiences from their communities and from their organizations during COVID or other crises, and identify challenges to programming and possible adaptations, and think through possible scenarios as one activity. It talks about the purpose, which would be to build on the ideas from the calls and possibly create specific tools, exercises, materials that can further support organizations in supporting communities. We have a list here of some, some suggested activities that the group that started this document put together, which are basically around how to systematize the learning from the calls. And it includes things like building up from anecdotes on the calls, trying to put some qualitative methods to transform these into more concrete evidence, expanding on some of the ideas to come up with actual potential solutions that people can apply, producing external facing documents, etc. We have imagined, we know people have lots of commitments and everyone is already dedicating time to this call every month, which has been amazing. So we don't want to make it too long. We've imagined that it could start as a smaller time commitment of 3 months, and it can always be grown if necessary. And then you'll see that the steps and deliverables and exact timelines, those things are to be developed by the working group, because this is something that would definitely need to be owned by the members and fed back into this larger group and the community beyond this call as well. So that's the very quick version. If you have thoughts on things that have been left out of this terms of reference, on other activities that should be done, if you would like to join, please, you can put that in the chat box. You can also, as I said, we'll make this public to everyone afterwards, so you can put comments there. And there's a couple of names that have already started to go in there of folks that are interested in potentially joining the working group. If you'd also be interested, you can add your name there. We'll be looking for co-chairs for the working group. And we will have it be public for 1 week until May 24th to give everyone time to read it more carefully. That was a very quick version because we're at time. Gunjan, we were going to do a quick poll to see whether this seemed like a reasonable starting point. Actually, Claire, that might be you. To see whether this seemed like a good starting point for a working group, or if we need to do some more thinking or revisit it as an idea at all. Do we have that?
And while that poll is happening, Nelly, people will see the poll, but just because we literally are at time and we need to close, just want to quickly make a couple of announcements. So for the next steps, we do intend to have a next call in July. Again, this is something that people have said that they want to continue doing, and this call, we're going to move slightly away from what we've been doing so far, in that we are going to hear a lot more from actually community leaders and community voices, and try and focus on, the situations maybe in particular areas. So but you'll hear more on that from us later on. The other quick announcement is actually an MCLD. And actually one more thing, the reflections piece that we had shared last time and was the basis of the last call, that has been shared. It's up on the MCLD website for everyone. And any comments, feedback is useful. We will probably be trying to work on something based on what's emerged today as well. And finally, the third announcement is that we actually have a special session for the Movement for Community-Led Development, a webinar that is being conducted by the Global GPSA at the World Bank, which is the I'm blanking out now on the full form of GPSA. But the Global Partnership for Social Accountability. Yes, the Global Partnership for Social Accountability. We are doing a webinar, especially on the movement on community-led development and social accountability during the times of COVID-19. It's on June 30th at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. We will share the details if people are interested. Yep. And then we will leave this on for a few minutes, just because we know that the conversations are pretty interesting, and people do like to leave some comments and feedback for us in the chat box. So we know many people need to drop off because we are on time. So thank you for everybody who joined and who needs to drop off, and for people who would like to stay back and share thoughts, ideas, comments, please feel free to do so. We will run this for at least another 5 minutes.
Thank you. Yes, and just to reiterate for the call next month, where we will highlight voices from communities themselves. If anyone knows anyone who would like to participate in that, just let us know, or has suggestions on how to run the next call. Those are very welcome. And the poll is still up, so you can input there, but I see people are also putting it into the chat box. So thank you all.